Have you ever caught yourself thinking something so bizarre, so completely off the wall, that you wondered if you were losing your mind? What if I told you that Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychological minds in history, believed these strange thoughts might actually be signs of genius? Today, we're diving deep into Jung's revolutionary understanding of the human psyche to uncover 7 types of weird thoughts that don't make you crazy. They make you brilliant. And I guarantee that by the end of this video, you'll never look at your strangest mental wanderings the same way again. But here's the thing. Most people dismiss these thoughts immediately. They push them down, ignore them, or worse, they feel ashamed of them. What Jung discovered will completely change how you see your own mind. Carl Jung spent decades studying the minds of both patients and geniuses, from artists to scientists to visionaries who changed the world. What he found was shocking. The same psychological patterns that society often labels as abnormal or strange were present in nearly every great mind throughout history. Jung called this the paradox of genius, that to think beyond the ordinary, you must first be willing to think in ways that seem extraordinary, even disturbing, to others. So if you've ever felt like your mind works differently, if you've ever had thoughts that made you question your own sanity, stay with me, because what you're about to discover might just reveal that you've been carrying the seeds of genius all along. Thought 1. You question everything, even obvious truths. The first sign Jung identified in the genius mind is what he called radical doubt, the compulsive need to question everything, even things that everyone else accepts as obviously true. Most people see the sky as blue and move on with their day. But if you're someone who finds yourself thinking, but wait, why do we call it blue? Is it really blue? Or is that just how our brains interpret certain wavelengths? What if other creatures see it completely differently? Then you're exhibiting what Jung considered a hallmark of genius. Jung observed this pattern in every revolutionary thinker he studied. Einstein questioned the obvious truth that time moves at a constant rate. Darwin questioned the obvious truth that species were unchanging. Tesla questioned the obvious limitations of electrical power. But here's what's fascinating, and this is where it gets strange. Jung noticed that genius-level questioners don't just doubt big, important things. They question everything. The shape of doorknobs, why we shake hands, why we say bless you when someone sneezes. To most people, this looks like overthinking, maybe even mental illness. Jung's patients would come to him distressed, saying, "Doctor, I can't stop questioning things that don't matter. There must be something wrong with me." But Jung realized something profound. These people weren't broken. They were operating on a level of consciousness that most humans never access. They were seeing through the illusions that keep ordinary minds trapped in conventional thinking. The strange thought pattern here is the inability to accept anything at face value. If you find yourself constantly asking, "But why?" about things others never question, Jung would say you're not being difficult, you're being brilliant. Thought 2. You imagine impossible scenarios and feel emotionally connected to them. The second strange thought pattern Jung identified in genius minds is what he called emotional investment in the impossible. Normal people daydream. But if you're someone who creates elaborate, impossible scenarios in your mind and then feels genuine emotions about them, sadness when imaginary characters suffer, joy when fictional worlds prosper, anger at injustices that never happened, most people would say you're taking fantasy too seriously. Jung saw it differently. He noticed that every great creator, inventor, and visionary he studied had this exact trait. They didn't just imagine impossible things, they lived in those impossibilities emotionally. Tesla would spend hours visualizing electrical machines that didn't exist, running them in his mind, feeling frustrated when they didn't work properly in his imagination, and experiencing genuine excitement when he solved problems that existed only in his head. Jung himself experienced this. He would create entire conversations with imaginary figures, what he later called active imagination, and these conversations would affect him as deeply as real interactions with real people. Here's where it gets really strange. Jung discovered that people with this trait often feel more connected to their imaginary scenarios than to reality. They might feel more understood by fictional characters than by real people. They might feel more at home in worlds that don't exist than in the world that does. Society calls this escapism, immaturity, or even delusion. But Jung called it genius preparation. He believed that the ability to emotionally inhabit impossible worlds was essential for eventually making those worlds possible. Every great invention started as an impossible scenario that someone cared about deeply enough to make real. Every social revolution began in someone's imagination as an impossible dream that they loved too much to abandon. If you find yourself crying over imaginary tragedies, celebrating fictional victories, or feeling homesick for places that don't exist, Jung would say you're not lost in fantasy, you're rehearsing for genius. Thought 3. You feel like you don't belong in this time period. The third strange thought Jung identified is temporal displacement, the persistent feeling that you were born in the wrong era. Most people feel generally at home in their time period. Sure, they might have preferences for past or future eras, but they don't feel fundamentally misplaced. But if you're someone who feels a deep, almost painful sense that you belong somewhere else in time, that you should have been born in ancient Greece or the Renaissance or somehow in the future, Jung believed this might indicate a genius-level consciousness. Here's why this is so strange. Jung noticed that people with this feeling aren't just romantically nostalgic about other eras. They feel a genuine sense of homesickness for times they never lived through. They might know more about daily life in 15th century Florence than about their own neighborhood. They might feel more kinship with long-dead philosophers than with their contemporaries. Jung experienced this himself. He often felt he belonged in medieval times, surrounded by alchemy and mystery rather than modern psychology and science. For years, he thought this meant something was wrong with him. But then he realized something remarkable. Every genius throughout history had reported similar feelings. They felt displaced, like visitors from another time trying to navigate an alien present. Jung theorized that genius consciousness operates on what he called archetypal time, a level of awareness that transcends the immediate historical moment. Genius minds naturally align with eternal patterns and timeless truths, rather than temporary cultural trends. This is why revolutionary thinkers often seem to predict the future or rediscover ancient wisdom. They're not bound by the limitations of their current time period because their consciousness operates outside normal temporal boundaries. The strange thought here isn't just, I wish I lived in another time. It's, I feel like I'm visiting this time period from somewhere else. If you've ever felt like you're wearing a costume when you try to fit into contemporary culture, if you've ever felt like you're speaking a foreign language when you use modern slang, if you've ever looked around and thought, these people are my species, but they're not my tribe, Jung would say you're experiencing genius-level temporal awareness. But here's the crucial part Jung discovered. This displacement isn't meant to make you retreat from your current time. It's meant to help you bring timeless wisdom into the present moment. You're not supposed to escape to another era. You're supposed to be a bridge between eras. Thought 4. You have intense conversations with yourself. The fourth strange thought pattern Jung identified is what he called internal dialogue complexity, but most people just call it talking to yourself like crazy. We all have internal conversations, But if you're someone who has elaborate, heated debates with different aspects of your personality, who argues with yourself so intensely that you forget other people are around, who has developed distinct internal voices with their own opinions and personalities, society says you might need therapy. Jung said you might be exhibiting advanced psychological integration. Jung discovered this through his own experience. After his break with Freud, he began having intense internal conversations with different parts of his psyche. These weren't just casual thoughts. They were full-blown dialogues with figures he eventually named Philemon, Salome, and others. At first, Jung was terrified. He thought he was developing schizophrenia. But then he realized something extraordinary. These internal figures were giving him insights he never could have reached through normal thinking. Jung came to understand that genius minds naturally develop what he called psychological multiplicity, the ability to access different perspectives by literally embodying different aspects of the psyche. Most people think with one voice, their ego voice, but genius minds think with orchestras. They can access the voice of their inner critic, their inner child, their inner rebel, their inner sage, and have them debate complex problems from multiple angles simultaneously. Here's what makes this truly strange. People with this trait often report that their internal conversations are more interesting, more challenging, and more enlightening than most of their external conversations. They might spend hours debating with themselves and come away feeling like they've had the most stimulating intellectual experience of their week. Society calls this antisocial or self-absorbed. Jung called it psychological genius. The ability to contain and coordinate multiple perspectives within one mind is what allows breakthrough thinking. It's how you can simultaneously be your own devil's advocate and your own supporter, your own student and your own teacher. If you've ever had arguments with yourself that were so intense you started gesturing and making facial expressions, if you've ever solved problems by having different parts of your personality debate the issue, if you've ever surprised yourself by what one of your internal voices said during a self-conversation, Jung would say you're not talking to yourself. You're accessing the collective intelligence of your complete psyche. Thought 5. You're obsessed with patterns that others can't see. The fifth strange thought Jung identified is pattern obsession. The compulsive need to find connections between things that appear completely unrelated. Most people see individual events and objects. But if you're someone who constantly notices patterns, the way cloud formations mirror your mood, how historical events repeat in cycles, connections between your dreams and random conversations you overhear, people often think you're reading too much into things. Jung experienced this intensely. He would notice that whenever he was thinking about a particular psychological concept, he would start encountering examples of it everywhere, in conversations, books, even in the behavior of animals he observed. At first, Jung tried to dismiss these observations as confirmation bias or coincidence. But the patterns were too consistent, too meaningful to ignore. This led him to develop his theory of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reveal the hidden connections underlying reality. Jung realized that genius minds are naturally attuned to what he called the objective psyche, the deeper patterns that organize both individual psychology and collective experience. While most people's attention is captured by surface events, genius minds automatically perceive the underlying structures. Here's where it gets really strange. People with this trait often become almost addicted to pattern recognition. They might spend hours analyzing the numerical patterns in their daily experiences, the symbolic meanings in random events, or the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated fields of knowledge. To others, this looks like magical thinking, or even paranoia. But Jung discovered that many of history's greatest insights came from people who noticed patterns that everyone else missed. Newton connected the falling apple to planetary motion. Darwin connected island finches to the origin of species. Freud connected dream imagery to psychological conflicts. The strange thought here isn't just noticing occasional patterns. It's the compulsive need to find the hidden order underlying apparent chaos. If you've ever felt like reality is constantly sending you messages through patterns and synchronicities, if you've ever become obsessed with finding the connections between seemingly random events, if you've ever felt like you can see the invisible threads that connect everything to everything else, Jung would say, you're not being paranoid. You're accessing what he called the transcendent function of consciousness. This is the mental capacity that allows breakthrough insights by perceiving relationships that aren't obvious to ordinary awareness. Thought 6. You feel responsible for problems you didn't create. The sixth strange thought pattern Jung identified is what he called transpersonal guilt, the feeling of being somehow responsible for problems, suffering, or conflicts that you had nothing to do with creating. Most people have a clear sense of personal responsibility. They feel guilty about things they actually did wrong, and they don't carry guilt for things beyond their control. But if you're someone who feels genuinely guilty about poverty you didn't cause, wars you didn't start, or suffering you couldn't prevent, if you lie awake at night feeling personally responsible for injustices happening on the other side of the world, most people would say you're taking things too personally. Jung said you might be experiencing the expanded consciousness that comes with genius-level awareness. Jung discovered this through his own psychological crisis. He became deeply depressed not just about his personal problems, but about what he called the problem of the world. He felt somehow responsible for all human suffering, as if his personal healing was connected to the healing of humanity itself. This seemed grandiose and narcissistic until Jung realized something profound. People with genius-level consciousness naturally identify with what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological substrate of all humanity. When your awareness expands beyond normal ego boundaries, you begin to feel personally connected to universal human experiences. You don't just think about global problems intellectually, you feel them emotionally as if they were your own problems. Here's what makes this truly strange. People with this trait often feel more guilty about distant suffering they couldn't prevent than about personal mistakes they actually made. They might spend more mental energy worrying about climate change than about their personal relationships. Society calls this neurotic, impractical, or a savior complex. Jung called it the natural result of transpersonal consciousness. Every great humanitarian, social reformer, and visionary leader Jung studied had this exact trait. They felt personally responsible for fixing problems they didn't create because their consciousness had expanded beyond personal boundaries. Martin Luther King Jr. felt personally responsible for racial injustice throughout America. Gandhi felt personally responsible for all human suffering caused by violence. Einstein felt personally responsible for the implications of nuclear weapons. The strange thought here isn't just caring about global problems. It's feeling like the world's problems are somehow your fault, even when logic tells you they're not. If you've ever felt guilty for not doing enough to solve problems you had no role in creating, if you've ever felt like personal happiness is somehow selfish when others are suffering, if you've ever experienced what Jung called the burden of consciousness, the feeling that awareness itself creates responsibility, Jung would say, you're not neurotic, you're experiencing genius-level consciousness expansion. This expanded sense of responsibility is what motivates the kind of breakthrough thinking that actually solves collective problems. Thought 7. You question your own sanity. The seventh and perhaps most paradoxical strange thought Jung identified is metacognitive doubt. regularly questioning your own mental stability and wondering if you might be going crazy. Most people rarely question their own sanity. They might have bad days or weird thoughts, but they generally trust that their minds are functioning normally. But if you're someone who regularly thinks, "Am I losing my mind? Are these thoughts normal? Maybe I'm going crazy and just don't realize it." If you find yourself constantly checking your own mental state and wondering if your thoughts are too strange, Jung believed this might actually indicate superior psychological health. This seems completely counterintuitive. Shouldn't mentally healthy people feel confident about their sanity? Jung discovered something remarkable. Every genius he studied went through periods of intense self-doubt about their mental stability. They questioned their perceptions, worried about their unusual thoughts, and feared they might be losing touch with reality. But Jung realized this wasn't a sign of mental illness. It was a sign of mental sophistication. The ability to observe your own mind objectively, to question your own thoughts and perceptions, to maintain awareness of your awareness. This is what Jung called metacognitive consciousness. Most people are so identified with their thoughts that they never step back to examine the thinking process itself. But genius minds naturally develop what Jung called the observing ego, the part of consciousness that can watch itself think. Here's what makes this truly strange. The more conscious you become of your own mental processes, the more weird and potentially unstable they seem. When you start paying close attention to how your mind actually works, the random associations, the illogical leaps, the emotional swings, the bizarre dream logic that influences waking thought, it can be genuinely disturbing. Jung went through a period he called his confrontation with the unconscious, where he seriously questioned his own sanity because he was becoming aware of psychological processes that most people never notice. But this self-questioning led to his greatest insights. By maintaining doubt about his own perceptions, Jung was able to discover psychological truths that people with more certainty about their mental state never access. The strange thought here is the persistent worry. What if I'm crazy and everyone else is normal? If you've ever found yourself thinking, maybe my thoughts are too weird, maybe I see things that aren't there, maybe I'm the one who's out of touch with reality, Jung would say. You're not developing mental illness, you're developing mental genius. The capacity for self-doubt is what prevents genius from becoming delusion. It's what keeps revolutionary thinking grounded in reality, even when it transcends conventional limits. Now here's what Jung discovered when he put all these strange thought patterns together. They're not separate traits. They're all expressions of what he called the transcendent function, the mind's natural capacity to move beyond ordinary consciousness into what he termed individuated awareness. Every genius throughout history has exhibited some combination of these 7 strange thought patterns. They question obvious truths. They emotionally invest in impossible scenarios. They feel displaced in time. They have complex internal dialogues. They're obsessed with hidden patterns. They feel responsible for collective problems, and they question their own sanity. But here's the crucial insight Jung discovered. These aren't just random weird thoughts. They're actually the mind's way of preparing itself for breakthrough thinking. When you question everything, you free yourself from limiting assumptions. When you emotionally invest in impossible scenarios, you develop the motivation to make them possible. When you feel displaced in time, you access timeless wisdom. When you have complex internal dialogues, you integrate multiple perspectives. When you see hidden patterns, you perceive deeper truths. When you feel responsible for collective problems, you develop the drive to solve them. And when you question your own sanity, you maintain the humility necessary for continued growth. Jung called this the hero's journey of consciousness, the psychological adventure that transforms strange thoughts into genius insights. But here's what most people don't understand. You can't cherry pick these traits. They come as a package. The same mental processes that produce genius also produce what society often labels as weirdness, instability, or even mental illness. This is why so many geniuses throughout history have been misunderstood, marginalized, or even persecuted. Their minds operate on a level that makes ordinary consciousness uncomfortable. Jung discovered something that should serve as a warning to anyone who recognizes these thought patterns in themselves. The greatest tragedy is not having strange thoughts, it's suppressing them to appear normal. Jung observed that many potentially brilliant minds never reach their full potential because they spend too much energy trying to think like everyone else. They dismiss their unusual insights, ignore their strange observations, and force themselves into conventional thought patterns. Jung called this psychological suicide, the murder of your authentic consciousness in service of social acceptance. If you recognize these strange thought patterns in yourself, Jung's advice was simple. Don't try to fix them. Develop them. Don't make them go away. Make them useful. The goal isn't to eliminate strange thoughts, it's to transform them into breakthrough insights. Jung believed that the world desperately needs people who think differently. Every major advancement in human civilization has come from someone who thought strange thoughts and had the courage to follow them to their logical conclusions. If you've recognized yourself in these 7 strange thought patterns, Jung would say you have a responsibility, not just to yourself, but to humanity, to develop these traits rather than suppress them. Start keeping track of your strangest thoughts instead of dismissing them. When you question obvious truths, write down what you're really asking. When you imagine impossible scenarios, explore what they might reveal about what's actually possible. When you feel displaced in time, research what eternal truths you might be accessing. When you have internal dialogues, pay attention to what different parts of your psyche are telling you. When you notice patterns others miss, investigate what they might mean. When you feel responsible for collective problems, consider how your unique perspective might contribute to solutions. And when you question your own sanity, remember that this self-awareness is actually a sign of psychological sophistication. Carl Jung spent his entire career studying the mystery of human consciousness, and one of his most profound discoveries was this. Genius isn't rare because genius-level intelligence is uncommon. Genius is rare because most people suppress their genius-level thoughts out of fear that they're too strange. The 7 thought patterns we've explored today aren't signs that something is wrong with your mind. They're signs that your mind is operating on a level that most people never access. Jung believed that every human being has the potential for genius-level consciousness, but only those brave enough to embrace their strangest thoughts ever develop it. So the next time you catch yourself thinking something so weird that you wonder if you're losing your mind, remember what Jung discovered. You're not going crazy. You might just be going genius. The question isn't whether you have strange thoughts. The question is what you're going to do with them. Jung's message to anyone who recognizes these patterns in themselves was clear. The world doesn't need more normal thinkers. It needs more people brave enough to think the thoughts that normal minds can't access. Your strange thoughts aren't a bug in your mental programming. They're a feature. Jung would say they're not a sign that you need to be fixed. They're a sign that you need to be developed. Because somewhere in those weird, uncomfortable, seemingly crazy thoughts that make you question your own sanity might be the insights that change everything. The genius was inside your strange thoughts all along. Jung just gave you permission to stop apologizing for them and start using them. What strange thought will you stop suppressing today? Let me know in the comments which of these 7 patterns resonated most with you, And don't forget to subscribe for more insights into the revolutionary psychology of Carl Jung. And if you'd like to go a step further in supporting this work, you can now leave a super thanks below. It's a small way to say thank you, and it truly helps keep this channel going.